There are so many Arabs who believe that they cannot be anti-Semitic because they are Semites themselves. I personally do not agree with this perspective, because I do believe that we're looking at Semitism from not point, but rather from a sociological standpoint, and thus even the origin of this term, when it was first used by Steinschneider and Merz, so they wanted to refer specifically to the racism toward Jews, or the prejudice toward Jews. So yes, Arabs can be anti-Semitic.
First of all, anti-Semitic was created in the 19th century. And indeed, the whole business of Semites and Aryans and so on is part of 19th century first anthropological discourse. And then the term anti-Semitism was actually coined by an anti-Semite as a modern word for what's wrong with Jews, pointing it out. And
I believe the name of
it wasn't meant to be for. It was also used, yes, by racists for everyone who didn't fall into the Aryan category, but they always were careful. For example, Hitler in Mein Kampf has anti-Arab remarks. But he said they're half-naked apes who only know the lash of the whip. But the German, when had it translated into Arabic, had those passages taken out, and had no problem, of course, dealing with the Arab world, because, of course, they were opposed to England and France, and England and France were the major colonial powers in the Arab world. So these terms are used rather loosely. Look, on the business of anti-Semitism, the Arab and the Islamic world, normally we make a difference in history between traditional Jew hatred, that is the church and why, and the things like the blood libel and so on, and then the modern, more, and I say modern in quotation, in the Islamic world, the Arab world, kind of Christian anti-Judaism and of modern racial anti-Semitism didn't exist until it came in the 19th century, and it first only struck roots with Arabic-speaking Christians. Then, of course, they helped to create modern pan-Arab nationalism and identity, and made use of this as one of the tools in their toolkit. Also trying to say, look, we are Arabs as well, and this only sank in among Muslims in the 20th century. The reasons that it did begin to sink in is that the founders of the Arab newspapers were almost all Syro-Lebanese Christians. And many of them went, in fact, to Cairo and founded some of the classic Arab newspapers. Even so, it didn't have wide circulation until the 1930s, 20s and 30s. Arab nationalists in Syria and Iraq and in the Mandate of Palestine, for the most part in places like Egypt, in the Maghreb and so on, it had very little echo. Then, of course, as the so-called Palestine conflict began to develop, then it was used more and more. But we have to look at it. It was something new. It was not traditional to Islamic society, and we look even, for example, in the 1920s. You don't have it in Egypt. That the first anti-Jewish demonstrations in modern Egypt are in the 1930s. By the way, the Egyptian governing elite were not at all affected by this. They really were not interested in this, but it did have roots with groups of either Islamic or Arab nationalists, groups like the Misr al-Fatat, groups like the Jamiat al-Shubban al-Islamiyya, and so on. And they pick this up, and they begin, of course, and then you have the classic work of modern anti-Semitism, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a creation of the Tsarist secret police, written in Paris. And in 1925, it's translated into Arabic. By the way, in Lebanon, actually by a Maronite priest. And it's given the title Mu'amarat al-Yahudiya al-Shu'ub, and the Jewish plots against the nations. And Egypt, because Cairo was the main place for Arabic publication, it really has greatest circulation in Greater Syria, Subri al-Kubra, and in Iraq. But then it begins more and more to strike roots. And I remember when I worked in the Arab world in the 1970s and the 1980s, I used to go into bookstores just to see if it was in the average bookstore. And of course it was. And there were many editions of it. And so many of these ideas begin to sink in. But again, Egypt, the ruling elite in Egypt was, or other groups that picked this up were the Ikhwan al-Muslimun, the Muslim Brotherhood. But again, what the first anti-Jewish demonstration in Egypt was in 1938. It was that late. And Egyptian police tried very hard to control it and to stop it. And then, of course, you had World War II when things were of course, put on hold. You had a great deal of Arabic propaganda from Germany and from Italy, from the fascists and the Nazis. But for the most part, this was controlled. And it's only at the end of the war that we begin to see, especially with these popular groups, like the ones that I mentioned. And that's when you begin to see it. And the first time that you actually have violence against Jews in Egypt is only in 1945 at the end of the war, and it's mostly attacks on businesses and so on. What's interesting is that it's played upon by the Islamists, like the Ikhwan and others, and you very often see that the anti-Jewish violence then becomes at the same time anti-Coptic, anti-Greek, and so on. And then, of course, it comes to a head in 1947 after the UN is voting on the partition of the Palestine Mandate into two states. And just a few days later, that's when you have the first real violence in many places: Cairo, Alexandria, Tanta, Suez City, and so on and so forth. But again, the government itself was not. The government was mostly secularists, and after all, they looked at what happened to the founder of the Ikhwan, Hassan al-Banna. He was assassinated by King Farouk's police. What happened later on to Syed Qutb, the philosopher of the movement? He was hanged by Nasser. And what happened to President al-Morsi? He was found guilty and put to death by President Assisi. So that this is something that developed in part. The reason you see so many regimes today that buy into this is, in some of them, they have their own fears of groups like this. I mean, you look, the Ikhwan are illegal, and the Ikhwan are the roots of Daesh, of Hamas, and so on. And the Ikhwan are illegal in almost every Arab country, with one exception, Qatar. Interestingly enough.
Gamal Abdel Nasser was he was against the group of the Muslim Brotherhood, but as well he really was behind also the expel of Jews from Egypt. So he was against the Muslim,
but remember, he was one of the great pan-Arabists, and the pan-Arabists had adopted this to a great extent. It served a purpose. They also knew that popular sentiments also bought into this now through the Islamic groups. And this was one of the ways. Look, the same thing in Iraq and Syria. The nationalists of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were mostly secularists. They were not pan-Islamists. And they had already adopted this language to a great extent. And unfortunately, so much, when you wrote to me and you asked, did they forget about what was happening to the Jews, both in their own countries and elsewhere? And the answer is, they completely put it aside. This was now the new reality. One of the things that's so sad is that you see so much of what then becomes written about Jews especially in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, is things that are supposedly academic, laden with these fantasies and images and so on. And it's a very sad commentary. In Morocco, and I've been married into a Moroccan family for almost 60 years, and I was a professor in Morocco, visiting professor, and so on. Serious efforts to counter this. The universities teach Jewish history, mostly in the Moroccan context. Also, in the public schools, just as they also began to recognize the Amazigh heritage, the Berbers, who are 40% of the population, identify as Amazighim, and they now teach that in school, in public school, and that is a major change.
In the UAE as well. So beginning in January of this year. That's a small but very important and significant step indeed. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the problem also with him was his belief in nationalism. And that was the main problem with the Jews in Europe back in the 19th century. At that time, we can say that the Arab world was not influenced by nationalism, but we can say that during maybe the 40s of the past century. But we can say also that because of the European imperialism, after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in the Arab world, when the Europeans came to the Arab world, they brought with them their belief system, whether if it's anti-Semitism and nationalism and all of that. And of course, Arabs were influenced by that. And of course, you mentioned the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and who was also met with Hitler and with Himmler and many Nazi leaders. And of course, yes, they were influenced by that.
We can see how already nationalists and as I said, especially the Syrian Christian minority, who were very important. I mean, for the whole Nahda movement, the revival of a literary Arabic language, with modern standard Arabic. The journalism was all dominated by these people, and they themselves, in a way, to try and prove their bona fides, they are espousing this and mouthing. And as I said, it takes time before the Muslim population absorbs this. And in the end, it didn't do them very much, the Christian Arab nationalists, very much good. Very often, minority groups tend towards forms of extremism in order to make their case. And if you look, for example, in Iraq, who are the members of the communists, the leaders of communism there? They're Christians, they're Jews, and they're Baha'is. It's a way of getting out of your minority status. The trouble is, it didn't do them much good, but it did a lot of damage because it penetrated into nationalism.
And one of the main problems is this kind of like as I told you, that the obliviousness or ignorance about the history of Jews in the region, the impact of that on our present time. For example, when we talk about the care, I'm trying to stay away from politics as much as possible, but it's always a very complex topic. Okay, when we're
Yes,
talking
but
about
remember, Ayatollah Khomeini said, "This world is political."
yes, exactly. That's true. So when we're talking about, for example, the struggle of the Palestinian people throughout history, whether it's the diaspora, what happened back in 1948, and all of that. So there is much awareness among Arabs about that. But when it comes to the Jews, there isn't. So it's very easy to look at Jews as the attackers, the oppressors, and
Yes.
the other side to look at the Palestinians as the victims. Why, when we look at the full picture, you'll find that both of them were victims at certain times, and especially the Jews, and before even the establishment of the state of Israel.
That people give their loyalty, their affection to a certain individual group, etc. And anything which doesn't fit in with that is simply pushed to the side. There always were people who knew otherwise. And I always remember an senior Egyptian scholar who did the Middle Ages, which is a safer place to deal with if you're dealing with Jews and so on. And he was invited to Saudi Arabia to teach, and he told them, "Look, this is what I do. You either have, and I have friends and colleagues in Israel. Take it or leave it." And they accept. People are willing to make all sorts of accommodations when it suits their purpose. And I must say, I'm an optimist. I still believe that people are basically good, and I'm hoping that we will see progress in all of this, and that we saw with the Emirates, we saw with Morocco. It says in the Quran, "Allah a'lam ma fil ghaib wa antum la ta'lamun." So I don't predict the future, but I look hopefully toward it.
Yes. also, but events like what happened right now, like for instance, I read an article recently about the surge of anti-Semitism nowadays. So every major event that happens between the Palestinians and Israel, that it keeps it it just makes the problem even bigger. That's the issue here.
Yes,
Um, yes, but
yes, you're well, you're absolutely right. What can I say? What you're saying is that's the state of affairs.
yes. Okay. So the question that I asked you before, whether if it's this unawareness about the history of Jews, whether if it's due to systematic campaigns or whether if just the absence or the fact that Jews were expelled and there are no longer most of them live in the Arab world, that already led to them being forgotten. We can say that it's kind of like a combination of both, maybe.
Yes,
Yeah.
because obviously, I mean, the English expression "out of sight, out of mind."
Yes.
These are no longer people that you deal with on a day-to-day. There's a big difference when you live among people, you deal with people, and so on. But also part of it was an ideological move. I mean, years ago, I did an article called what was it called? New Attitudes Towards the Jews in the Arab World. And I remember I read literally dozens and dozens of books, including academic books, that said all sorts of terrible things. But but this had its effect, and you use it. You raise when you use it in schools, you use it in universities, and so on. This suddenly one asks oneself, can one really believe some of these things? Look, I remember there was an article in Al Musawar, with the magazine in Egypt, early 70s, and it was an interview with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, and he says, they have this horrible custom that we've discovered they kill Christian children and use their blood to make
Yes.
blood.
I read
And
that
I
today.
asked myself, could he really believe that? And maybe yes. I mean, the blood libel was widespread. I remember once I was working in Morocco, and famous book dealer, who was a Hajj, and I purchased for a university from him. At that time, 1970s, $1,000 worth of books was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he invited me to lunch. King Faisal was just assassinated in Riyadh. He said to me, he didn't. Of course, he did not know I was Jewish, and he said, the Jews killed Faisal. And I said to him, Hajj, he was killed in his palace by someone from the royal family.
Yes, from his family, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, it was like, and I said there are no Jews there, and he said, and I still remember he looked at me and he went like this, and he said, forgive the Moroccan accent, and he said, لا لا اليهود والفلوس ديالهم بتاعهم.
Uh,
Uh, uh,
you know, I think this is a very when we discuss the root of this issue itself. I remember last week I was talking about this to an Israeli person, and we were discussing why it just not just even from in the Arab world, but worldwide throughout history, Jews were always targeted. And I was asking him why, and I have a theory, and I will tell to you, and I would like to hear your opinion about it. But I think this is stems from the origin of or the nature of Judaism itself. That it's not a missionary religion like Christianity and Islam. And so these religions kind of because of they are missionary, they travel all over the world. They communicate with other people. They try to spread the word or the message. Unlike Christians who were they marry from each other. They don't have this idea of spreading their religion. So they always were more secretive groups for like in the communities, for example. And thus, whenever there is this there is an economical issue or political issue, and they don't know the reason behind it, so they use the Jews as the scapegoat. So they don't know the explanation exactly. For example, to this day, for example, with COVID-19, when people were not aware of the origin of it, they all just said it's the Jews because this secretive group of people. So they always they're the victims. So they're introduced as the scapegoats.
Look, which historian was it? Salo Baron referred to anti-Semitism as the dislike of the unlike. That here was a group that was noticeably different, a small but long-lasting cultural group. And aside from, of course, the negative ideas that develop in Christianity early on, that
Yes.
the very fact that a minority survives through all of this does raise question. What is it about them? Why do they why are they still there, and why are they maintaining the identity and difference and so on? Also, when things are going well for you, you really don't care that much about the other. You may have negative ideas, but you can put them aside. When things are tense and critical and so on, you want A, to be able to blame someone, and B, you want that someone else should, if I've got it bad, someone else has to have it worse. And if you look, for example, at the golden age of Islam, in the period of the Beit al-Hikmah in Baghdad, and you look at the growth of science, philosophy, and so on, you see that Islam is at its most tolerant, its most open self. Again, as I said, like all religions, it has ideas about others. By the way, Judaism does too. They all do. The difference is Jews were never a ruling group, or at least not for the last 2,000 years. So for the most part, they didn't adopt their negative ideas. Then you see, as the medieval Islamic world is declining economically, intellectually, and in every other way, and under pressure from the outside, from the Christians of the Crusades, from the Mongols, and so on, then you really don't have time to be tolerant of minorities. But by the way, during that period of decline, the intolerance was also towards Christians,
Exactly. Not just
towards to Jews. But in the modern times, and that's the other thing, modernity has had, and when we talk about modernity, the great changes sociologically, economically, technologically, politically, that have taken place over the last 200 years have had a profound effect on how people deal with each other. The modernity was taken in a very different way in the Arab Islamic world than it was, say in Western, for a number of reasons. One, because of foreign domination. Two, because this was now a different whole religious world that was dominant, and people had to deal with that as well. And Christians and minorities, especially in the Islamic world, welcomed both foreign influence and modernity because saw it as bettering their own situation, which it did, at least for a period of time. But for the majority of people, it was not bettering their world. And their reaction was of negativity to those who did have this positive reaction to it.
Yes, and we can also say that, like you just talked about the intolerant of Jews that happened later on, even in the Mamluk era, and what you have mentioned in your book, for example, they were forced to wear certain clothes and all of that, and they were, for example,
Riyar.
yes, Riyar.
Riyar.
Yes, and the Muslim women were forced not to communicate with Jewish women, for example, and all of that. But again, because we are trying to be unbiased to a certain extent, and this is your policy in general, and I understand that, and I do appreciate that a lot. And but we can say that also from our that can be sound like what happened to Jews at that time, and that those sorts of intolerance can be looked at as dramatic based on our own and current human rights standards. But at that time, just considering what used to happen to Jews in Europe for the Inquisition, for example, and all the other stuff. So yes, there were some sort of tolerant to Jews in the Arab world, and they had a chance, obviously, to prosper and to be successful in different fields. So yeah, we can say that until the 19th or probably the past century, and the real problem started to emerge.
Yes, yes. And again, by the way, on a daily basis, people, it's when that Muslim women should not have discourse with Jewish women or Christian women and so on a daily basis. This was very often ignored amongst people who lived near each other, who worked together, and so on. Yes, there were also in places where there was a strict separation. That, look, people are people, and when they live together, especially if they have similar economic background, similar sociological background, and so on, then they deal with each other on a day. Now that could also be cut very sharply in times of stress. That's true. Not cut and dried and permanent in the way they operate.
Yes, but I think that when we're talking about the minorities being targeted, I do believe that Jews are being targeted more than other minorities in the Middle East. um, even if you're
Yes.
talking, even if we're talking politically about Israel, for example, you have, for example, United States, the war in Iraq. Back in 2021, the Iraqi parliament passed a bill in February that demands that every person, every Iraqi that communicates with an Israeli person should be executed. So just considering that, and considering the history of Iraq with the United States, a country that the majority of it is Christians. So why this bill is not passed when it comes to the communication with Americans? So obviously there is a thing about Jews. It's not about human rights. It's not about political issues. It's not about war. It's just a thing about Jews specifically, and this is what I cannot understand. Why?
Iraq has one of the most violent histories in modern times, vis-a-vis its Jewish population and its Christian population. You had, what was it, in 1930?
The Farhud massacre.
No, the Farhud is in
41. 41, yes.
But you have the massacre of the Christians in the north of Iraq. We're trying to have semi-independence up there, and they are massacred unmercifully. Iraq has a much more violent history, for example, than Egypt. I must tell you. And of course, look during with the Kurds and so on.
Yes.
They did not have a good time of it in modern times either. So the Jews are one small group, and it's easier to see with them. But also, you have to look the Christian population. Many of the Muslim countries started to leave already in the 19th century when they got Western educations. This was again part of the modernity, and would go off to they would go off to places where they could be better off. And by the way, that was also true of many Jews, but also within the Islamic world. Egypt gets many Syrian Jews, Syrian Christians, Syrian Jews, North African Jews who come in from the time of the Suez Canal on, because Egypt is the most modern, the most developed, the most prosperous country in the Islamic world, bar none. And many of them, as I said, have come from other places, from the Turkish islands in the Aegean, and so on. Many go to South America. That's how you have the huge populations there of Arab extraction and so on. But those who stayed behind, and it's particularly the Jews, because of the particular conflict of the Palestine issue, they in a sense, we focus on that, and they were focused upon.
Yeah, that's
That's
very
more difficult. And I could give you my standard lines when I was asked. I never liked being what they call a talking head in the United States. And especially when suddenly you're asked to make predictions, my political science colleagues never had a problem with it. Sometimes they were wrong. Nobody remembered. They didn't care. I would care. And my usual line was, I'm a historian. I have enough trouble trying to figure out the past. I don't predict the future. We're having a discussion. This isn't a live television show. Look, who would have expected that we would have seen the Abraham Accord? Who would have expected?
yes.
Who would have even
With Saudi
expected?
Arabia,
And who would have expected the cold peace, because it's not a warm peace, but the cold peace with Egypt when Sadat made peace with Egypt. I was a visiting professor in Israel that year, and I remember that we were all so taken aback. And how I remember I was teaching at the University of Haifa for the year, and we went out with the children and so on as his motorcade came by to wave to him, and so on. And of course, and even if it wasn't a warm embrace, and that partially it would have been warmer, but unfortunately he was assassinated. Many regimes were cautious when they saw, again, look, when the revolutionaries overthrew King Farouk in 52. Just 2 months later, Colonel Naguib went to the main synagogue of Cairo on the Day of Atonement, as the famous picture of him coming in there and so on, to show you have nothing to worry about. You are our fellow Egyptians. So it's not instant. One of the problems, the famous line of Abba Ibn, that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and that when they had the opportunity in 48 to accept the partition, which they got the bulk of territory, they were against it. They were against later on the famous 3 no's. They were even with Barak and Yasser Arafat. When they met at Camp David, and Barak offered him something most Israelis would never dream of offering, including dividing the city of Jerusalem to be a capital for both, and they rejected. It wasn't enough. So
To
that
establish a Palestinian state as well, there was a conference in here in Egypt, and Yasser Arafat refused to attend it.
that's right. Look, you ask me, and I'm sure my more nationalist Israeli colleagues would look at me and so on. The two-state solution, of course, it's the ideal solution, but is it a realistic one at the present? And I must say on that one, the answer is no. But do I think it is the ideal? Yes, and that I hope, inshallah, im yirtzeh Hashem in Hebrew, if God wills it, that one day people will have on both sides, because you need it. It has to sides. That will. But on that one, I'm 2 years away from being 80 years old. I hope that I will live to see it, but I've lived to see many good things take place as well as many bad things. So yes, let's be hopeful. And of course, look, the fact that you have a group like yours and so on,